So welcome to the first ever edition of Lapidus Magazine's In Conversation With. As co-editors, Alison Cable and I, Kate Poll, warmly welcome a longtime friend of Lapidus International, Dr. Jeannie Wright, who is joining us today. Jeannie has been a member of Lapidus since the 90s, a pioneer in the field of therapeutic writing. Jeannie's PhD explored the use of expressive and reflective writing in counselling and psychotherapy. And many of our listeners might be familiar with her co-edited book, Writing Cures, a foundational text in our field. Over the years, Jeannie has contributed many chapters and papers. In fact, I believe that the large number and range might have precipitated her latest paper, but more of that in a moment, perhaps. Welcome, Jeannie.
Thank you. Yeah.
To start us off, could you share with us how you first got into writing for wellbeing?
Yes, I was one of those children who, because of birth position, with two older sisters who tend to be much more towards the extrovert end of the spectrum, and I like to write. I like to read and write. And I realize now that sometimes I've lost sight of that, that for some people speaking is much easier. And so is dancing or drawing or any number of other things. But I did keep diaries from a very young age. And I did start to be interested in what was going on in a kind of interior world and in relationships. So the diary became a friend, there's no doubt, in that very traditional St. Augustine confessional onwards. And I think and it was ironic that it should have been at the University of the South Pacific that I found the references to this being a thing, that this was a formal therapeutic practice. And finding James Pennebaker's work on opening up and writing to heal, in those early 1990s papers and books, I remember being so excited, I actually ran out of the library and back to my office on campus to write about it. That was the first thing that came to mind. So often in those situations of some professional isolation, it would be literally the piece of paper. I wasn't then, and still don't, write very spontaneously on a keyboard. But email seems to me a way to go. So who knows? I suppose I have changed over the years in the way that I use those diaries and journals. And I certainly don't rule out how the future may change our practices. But I'm really aware of how we changed our kind of byline in Lapidus because someone else had put an embargo on it, and I still can't believe that we had to do that. So whether it's writing for wellbeing, whether it's words for wellbeing, I know I started young and I know it's still where I am. This is a practice that gives me such clarity and such a sense of relief very often. And then, and I'll say this now, at this time of year very often, and because there's 6 inches of snow outside, I do tend to hibernate a bit and go through old journals. And I'm doing that rereading with a sense of, this is like time travel. And I'm meeting myself coming back. I think Emma Decent uses that title for one of her workshops. And it is an extraordinary thing. It really is. And I have complete agency over what I then do with that writing. And that, for me, is one of the crucial and powerful ways that writing's worked for me. Yeah, for years.
Oh, Jeannie, this idea of rereading your own work from across the years as time travel is really fascinating, and what, in a way, it's a treasure trove that you have that you can mine. So Jeannie's referring to the retrospective essay that she recently wrote for the October 2024 issue of Lyric Journal, entitled Answering to Myself in Writing. I invite listeners to check it out. It's online. And so I wonder, Jeannie, if you could speak more about the experience of rereading your research papers for this piece. Were there surprises? Did things resonate differently?
Yes, I think, you know, one of the major themes from a feminist lens of all of those papers is a woman's right to write. And I think that's how I would really say in the rereading, and particularly what's going on currently, not just in Britain, not just in Europe, but in the world, I'm profoundly disappointed that what's still such a crucial problem of violence within the family, violence in society against women, femicide, as the United Nations coined the phrase from homicide, is still such an issue. You know, that we still somehow beyond that sense of where is a woman safe? Where are girls safe? Now, I know that this brings up all sorts of very sticky problems around gendered identity, and I don't want us to get lost in a kind of second wave feminist trap. I know that this is true across the board. It is also the case that the vast majority of violent crime is by men against women, and that one of the things that comes up for me when I reread those papers from the 90s, and even before when I was working in women's centres in the 80s, is a woman not having any power, whether that's physically or emotionally or socially, and not having the space to find what it is that she wants to do or say. And what happened in the counselling room is that sometimes, and I want to emphasise, it's not everybody who wants to work with writing, but some women they would write a list, for example, you know, and even writing a letter to yourself is such a powerful thing. So often the shame that stops more expression of what's happening came up again in that research that we did once I'd moved to Malta. So this is talking about 2015, 2016. And those women who were using a voluntary agency in Warwickshire, which was specifically looking at sexual abuse, were able to use writing as a way to overcome the shame of talking about what had happened to them, their experiences. So, yeah, it's an answer that I hope enables you and people to see just how little progress we've made. You know, I know in some ways we have all kinds of legislation and all kinds of steps. But when I look at the statistics about domestic violence, about sexual abuse, about, you know, not just, as I say, in the European context, but globally, it's kind of horrifying. And that is what struck me rereading those papers. I thought, oh, it's still so relevant. Yeah.
And the idea of, or the practice of using writing, as you say, a simple list, and I shouldn't say simple, but
Yeah.
a list or a letter to oneself. It seems so easy or simple, and yet the space isn't always made.
Yes.
Or the permission given.
Yes. And it's terrifying. You know, people were frightened. So that's, again, ironically, as I told the story about the woman from one of the outlying islands of Tonga who came into the counselling service and daren't continue to keep those in-person appointments because these are small communities and word gets out. And that's why she suggested, she was an administrative, to me, powerhouse. She was a student in education, but she had a tremendous ability to use the then, to me, new technology. This is 1997, 98. So her suggestion to use email was kind of, well, yeah, why not? It seems bizarre now, to be talking in this way. But the fact is, those universities are often very well funded by international agencies, and that was the case with the University of the South Pacific. Whereas the universities I'd worked at in the British Midlands, they could barely afford to get me a desk. The counselling room at one of those places was in a kind of boot cupboard. So, the idea of having technology and having the capacity to be able to think about the ethical implications of that came about because of a move to a so-called underdeveloped country. So, yeah, it is entertaining.
Yeah. Speaking of sort of, I don't know if it's contradictions, but these kind of, I've heard you say that you're not that keen on technology yourself, and yet you're quite a vanguard in the idea of doing counselling via email, which is what you're referring to in relation to that paper. So you're not shy to use it as we're using it today when it's useful, when it builds connection.
I could really see the potential, but I just get so frustrated that I'm no way ever relaxed with it. I'm not a natural with it. If I can do something that presses the wrong button, I'll never be confident around it. And that's why I sometimes miss the IT support that proper jobs give you. Yeah, and it's why retiring was a bit of a, when I wrote the list, and I found it the other day, the list of pros and cons of leaving contracted work in university. Top of the list was the printer, and after that was IT support. That was the downside. And some of the colleagues and students that really, of all of that institutional support. Yeah.
And for listeners, without minimizing in any way your experience or challenges with technology, it's worth bearing in mind that this is someone who is talking, who not only does supervision via email, but does voice to text whilst babysitting her grandchildren, and at the same time doing work email. So, just to put it in context, you're no Luddite.
This is the nature of somehow the way that serendipity, I am going to use that word, has worked. In New Zealand, arthritis in my hands meant that I actually was struggling to use a keyboard. And a person there who had a similar problem, who was from the States, like me, an expat working at a New Zealand university, showed me how to use the voice to text technology, which was 2006. And at that time was really new. And that was just such a breakthrough. Yeah. And I still use that. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm still happier if I'm doing any kind of creative writing with a pencil or pen in my hand, however much it might. I'm doing this as I speak because my hands kind of freeze up. Yeah. And we're talking aging, aren't we? We are talking about different ages and stages. I know some very unfortunate people have arthritic conditions in their early life, but for me, it's definitely got better as it's gone on. Yeah.
So technology definitely made writing and sharing more accessible in many different ways.
Yes, it's an important point.
So, I'm hearing themes emerging around empowering women and the changing field in terms of technology. Were there any other key themes that you chose to focus on as you sort of looked back over this body of work?
Yeah, I think when I realized that people were putting their journals onto the internet, This became a thing, didn't it? You know, that people, I still don't know what it's called. I mean, I'm not on any of the social media platforms, but the whole idea of being so open about those most private experiences, emotions, thoughts, was absolutely bizarre to me. I just couldn't understand it, because I think the way that I use writing is to say this is safe. Nobody else's eyes are going to see this. And it's how I introduce a writing workshop with new members. You know, this is a safe space. Look, no one else is going to see this. You can do whatever you like with it. I actually have little laminated posters up on the walls, you know, if it's an in-person workshop, of course. But I still, for me, one of the reasons why it's so powerful is that I can say anything. And it's why I notice in my going through my journals and diaries at the turn of the year, I occasionally use Italian. Because you see, the fear is, it's like the woman in the Alba de Cespedes Forbidden Notebook. The fear is that somebody will find it and read it. And I don't want that. That's not what I want. So, and again, as age catches you, I start to think, well, I don't want my kids reading it. You know, this is about things I really don't want them to know. So this week I've got rid of the loads. It's all been binned and burned, and I feel very good about that because it served its purpose. And you know, they haven't got my interest in Italian. It's very unlikely they'd translate it. But it is again the feeling of being in control. No one else has the say, and that's what's so powerful for women in this society too, I would argue. You know, it's not the therapist who tells you, it's coming from your own sense of what is it I want to say, and then to reread it, hopefully after some period of time so that the reflection is fresh, and then to take from that, you know, the insight, that the contradiction, people change all the time, of course. So yeah, it's been so important, the privacy for me, and the idea of putting some kind of blog is so anathema, you know, that I still can't quite get my head around that. But I gather that there is a real power in it, a benefit in it. So I'm open to that, of course. It's just never going to be what I do.
It's interesting because I find that so wholeheartedly relatable. In fact, when I first started doing the Metanoia MSc, one of my issues was always that fear of exposure, that someone would read it. And then sort of course, did a 3-year course where you're sharing your work, and then, you know, but you talk about, you know, people who are blogging and just spewing their guts on a page and putting it out there for anyone. But coincidentally, I've been thinking a lot about that recently, and I just finished a book, not literary at all, by Lou Sanders, called "What's That Lady Doing?", which I was thinking of doing a book review for the magazine, and it really brought home the power of people who are willing to own our female stories, and metabolize that societal change and reframe it, and to be able to talk about where we muck up, or about our physical imperfections, or about traumas we've experienced, often at the hands of men, and not to let that be our shame. And not to get too distracted. But of course, there is that woman in France who was so great.
Yes.
And so there is a power in people who do say, well, actually, why should I be ashamed? And this is my story. And
there is, and from Rachel Cusk, from all kinds of current novelists and autobiographical fiction, and people like Annie Ernaux, you know, Nobel Prize winner, there is a whole new genre, and I absolutely respect and honor that. I know for me, the struggle would be if I were to write fictionally, which I think I am doing more and more, that's the way my writing's tending to go, it frees me up. But I'm still conscious that, you know, probably you could argue all novelists, all poets, all dramatists use their own material, of course. And I don't know where, in an academic context, we're any further forward than the wonderful Andrew Sparks paper illustrates, you know, with the ways that autoethnography is never going to overcome the accusation of being unethical. But then Andrew Sparks' argument is all qualitative research. You could say much the same about it. You know, most of the time, I mean, of course, there are ways of anonymizing, but we've got very caught up as autoethnographers and as people who use narrative in an academic context with how do we get through the ethical committees? You know, we really have. And I fear, for me, it's meant, okay, then I start looking at different genres. I start looking at different potential audiences, even if it's, in a way, I'm important to me these days, who the audiences. I'm more writing for me.
Mm.
Yeah.
And bringing it back to that, away from the academic, back to the sort of everyday writing for our own well-being. In your latest paper, you did talk about writing as an anchor. I'd love you to speak more about that.
Yeah.
For us to relate.
Well, and the illustrations that I'm currently thinking about, you know, I wrote a list of people who seem to me to have a different way of dealing with their life's crises, are blessed, perhaps, because they seem to find it easy to say it. Now, coming from someone who's earned a living for decades as a talking therapist, I realize that there's a certain irony. But actually, when I look back over a number of times, I've found talking therapy to be difficult for me, and that using the writing, at least as an adjunct, gave me a much stronger sense of, hold on a minute, who is in the listening seat here? And who is it who's come to work through some sort of relational complexity, some kind of crisis? And, you know, it's not every therapist I've worked with who's been able to stay out of my way enough. And what the page does is stay out of my way totally. It's completely reliable. And of course, it's a self-dialogue. You know, I'm aware that it's a dialogue with me. And it works. And I'm delighted that the Lapidus website has such a fantastic bibliography. You know, that Kate McBarron keeps updated, and I'm sure so do various other people. Because what it gives us, I guess what I've been looking for all these years, is some kind of legitimacy that started for me with Pennebaker. You know, the social psychologist using the scientific method, whatever that meant. But feeling as if that gave me, the English literature graduate, you know, with a very different view of how you conduct research. Yeah, it's that feeling of, why are we still struggling for that legitimacy? And why is using writing in a therapeutic context still so minor compared with, say, art therapy, dance therapy, any number of other regulated and well-established therapies? And I've been saying this, it's kind of boring, I've been saying it for so long, and I still don't know the answer to that. I tell you what, though, I did write down this kind of story, and it was about how people with a marketing flair know it works. Because I was at St Pancras, my train was late. And I went into that rather posh bookshop, I can't remember the name of it. And there, right by the door, prime position, was this notebook, beautifully, beautifully printed. And, you know, the feel of it was kind of pleasing. And what it was a series of blank pages produced by a woman who's a therapist in San Diego, California, with a few comments here and there. And she did reference Penny Baker. And I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. You know, I didn't know whether to say, how wonderful is this? That any train traveler could come in and say, oh, yeah, you know, I could do with writing down my thoughts and feelings. And here's somebody who's a therapist who tells me that it works and it's safe. How wonderful is that for $14.99? And the other bit of me was thinking, you know, all these years we've been doing this work. And goodness knows, James Pennebaker kind of gave up on it and set off on a different track, didn't he? And I think still is doing as emeritus professor. He's much more interested in pronouns and the kind of nuts and bolts of it. Whereas for me, I'm still saying the same thing. And I don't know whether that's persistent or whether it's being stuck. And I think one of the reasons why I continue to work in the field with some wonderful students who keep me informed and alive to what's happening in current research and current practice. And I would love to know what you're doing. I would love to know about your work, you know, at some stage. It's about that keeping current because things are changing. And Lapidus Living Research Community, with its wonderful stream of speakers, demonstrates that month by month by month. So I kind of carry on. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Did that answer the question? I fear it.
Well, it was about anchoring, and I feel as if, in terms of the therapeutic relationship, am I right in thinking that you were saying that the anchor is that where the limits of the therapist's worldview or interpersonal skills come, the page can take over, because and that is very much in work that I'm developing, that I actually started with you through my dissertation, sort of dialoguing through compassion journaling. So that I can see how that keeps one anchored with self-agency.
Yeah.
It amused me that you were talking about beautiful journals, as you've gone from sort of journaling with gorgeous journals to shoving them under the bed, and now only seemingly using scraps of paper. So I'm interested to know how your relationship has changed with journaling over time.
You see, I've always been a bit like that. I like to use scrap paper because then it doesn't matter. Do you see what I mean? People have given me beautiful journals, and I have some of them, but I've been a bit inhibited to writing them. And it's why I like pencil as well. You know, Judy Bolton talks about that, doesn't she? The HB pencil. And it is about feeling free. It's the freedom that gives me. So half the time, the stuff I'm putting in the bin at the moment, it's written on the back of all sorts of flyers, you know, that date back to 1994. So it's a kind of joyful historical record in a way. But then what I'm also doing is, it's almost like a distillation process of taking some of the words that were written in the moment on anything, you know, any kind of paper that came to hand, and I'm distilling them, and I am putting those, whatever they might end up being, into digital form. And they're more open to whoever might read them. And of course, this is the joy of poetry, that the symbolism is just that little bit more opaque, isn't it? You know, rather like I envy people who have art therapy, dance drama therapy. It's clearly a different way of communicating. It isn't as accessible necessarily to other people. Yeah. So I suppose some of the person-centered practices that I've been blessed with have combined different art forms. So using writing with dance, using painting and drawing with writing, you know, and then the way in which the person-centered approach allows for that compassion and self-compassion, the lack of judgment, the empathy, the genuineness. Yeah, again, I know that it's not cutting edge, and that's okay.
Well, I was just thinking, sign me up. I love the idea of combining. I've got my, you know, the writing with the art therapy, and then a bit of dance therapy. I'm all in. I find it interesting. I completely hear what you say about it can be a bit intimidating having something too beautiful. It almost feels like you're spoiling it by using it.
Yeah,
But at the same time, you up until now you're culling, but or you've kept all these scraps,
yeah.
and I'm interested to know whether you've found whether a journal almost acts as a curator, and whether having lots of different scraps, whether it keeps it alive, but maybe there's also an element that there may be a repetitiveness, like repetitive themes or neuroses or whatever it is that just keep coming back.
So true. I mean, I bore myself to death with saying how I hate the grey cold. You know, what am I doing living in Sheffield? How many times have I tried to get away from this climate? And really, it's kind of insane. Yeah. And can you just say that again, Kate, so that I can, because I'd formulated an answer and then went into the
It talks about how a journal could act as almost like a curator, whereas if you've got the scraps. Yep, you got it.
You see, I feel very blessed that I've lived this long, because having carried those literally boxes full and bags full of papers across the world, you know, now. So it was back from Fiji, then to New Zealand, then back to Britain, and then to Malta. And, you know, the number of times they went backwards and forwards. And it didn't occur to me that if something happened to me in those different peregrinations, I don't know what would happen to those boxes. Whereas now I'm in a position where I've lived here now for 6 years and I'm getting rid of stuff. And I do see it as a generative stage, you know, those ideas about human development. I mean, I'm not taking them terribly seriously, but I do have more of a sense of now is time to get rid of things that otherwise you're going to leave a mess for other people to clear up. You know, that really is quite a strong idea in my mind, and it's not without its merits. Yeah. So I think it was crucial for me in setting off the countries where I knew nobody, didn't have anywhere to live, you know, had a job, and even more, coming back to Britain and not having anywhere to live. It was so important for me to know somehow those boxes mattered enough to me to cart them around.
So that interests me, because I was about to ask you, was the power in them as a collective? You just said the boxes.
Yeah.
So it was more the collective idea of they knew you and your journey, and then you were bringing it with you, rather than you making an active choice on every single specific journal, knowing what was in each one.
Absolutely right. Yes. Yes, there is a better account in some of that paper I've chucked over this last week of who I am than probably anywhere else. And it's yeah, it is again a serendipitous moment when meeting Jane, who used a fictional name in New Zealand, who was another expat and who'd arrived with a habit of diary and journal writing. You know, she talked about, will I take these into my coffin? It was so important to her to start. She used a kind of morning pages. And that was a fascinating series of conversations we had about not only how important the writing had been, the process of it, the very physical nature of it, but also what she was going to do with it. And I do think there's a whole other story about how, if Lapidus represents this whole fictional, autobiographical, creative, therapeutic writing, where are we up to in terms of making this practice much more established? Where can we take it next? And how come, for all our efforts, you know, and it is wonderful to see how vibrant Lapidus International is at the moment. It really is. It's so heartening. And somehow, you know, maybe it isn't a question even. Maybe practitioners are just doing this. Maybe the therapist in San Diego have the nous to produce this beautiful journal and sell it on St. Pancras Station. You know, maybe that's it. But I suppose for me, I would like to think we will get a bit further with an ethical framework.
I can tell you being a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think you know that this is a topic that is very much of interest to me as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you touched on marketing, and you said in one of your papers that if we don't have a name for something, it's hard to sell it.
Yeah.
There's also lots of different forms of writing, so you've got some that are more akin to art therapy, and you've got things that are very writing for well-being, like that journal, and then you've got therapeutic writing. I would personally love to see a conference just on this subject itself.
Yeah, it would be enough, wouldn't it? It would be enough. And I think the difficulty of the work that's needed for a more extensive ethical framework is so vast. I mean, it's all very well. I noticed Barbara and I referred to the BACP framework in the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. I know how that came about, and I know how much it cost. You know, we're talking about a much bigger organisation which has the resource, had the resources, produced the framework, trialed it. You know, I remember going to some of those workshops across the country. It was a huge project. I don't know that Lapidus has got those resources. I really don't. And it, of course, we've always talked about how we might merge with other organisations. And it has always struck me that, I don't know what it would be called, a multi-form, expressive, creative, therapeutic practice. Yeah, but I mean, knowing, sadly, just how hard some of those bureaucratic and regulatory bodies can be, I'm not, sad to say, putting myself forward for that work. I noticed myself refusing. You know, when it came up about 3-4 years ago, I thought, no, that's just, I can't do that.
What specifically came up?
Well, at the time, we were talking about updating and extending the Code of Ethics, the current Lapidus Code of Ethics.
But which we've been doing. Buki and Lucy have been doing a lot of work on that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
brilliant.
And Emma. So.
Yes, that's great.
yeah, there
I
is,
absolutely applaud it, but I'm stepping back in a sense.
Although I guess this is stepping back and doing this retrospective piece. You're also taking a look at the field in itself.
Yeah.
And are there specific areas you would like to see individuals and groups and organizations like Lapidus building on in terms of research in order to, I mean, you mentioned of the barriers, for example, for therapeutic writing to become an arts discipline, but art has pushed through.
Yes, it is.
And
Yeah.
we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could be looking at the commonalities between all the creative arts therapies.
Yes.
And then meeting.
Which has been done. I'm sure you've got the books on your shelves.
Mhm.
And the fragmentation is what we've spoken about a lot, haven't we, in professional circles, in Lapidus International and beyond. But one of the advantages, I've worked with arts therapists, and on the whole, they're working in medical settings, and they came up through that route. So they were based, as I understand it, primarily in residential mental health settings, and then more in community settings. But it was in Britain, I think, through the NHS. You know, because people were working in the NHS, the regulatory framework was a given. They had to do it because nobody could work within the NHS. As I understand it, I could well be wrong, without having the careful, ethical and professional framing of regulation.
Mm-hmm.
So the same with music therapy. I think it started in medical settings. And, you know, I work with music therapists in New Zealand. They were doing amazing things. And we did some writing and some music. And I envied their professional framework. But I think, given that everybody writes, and given that it is our very success in terms of, you know, people are using creative writing for therapeutic purposes in so many different settings. I couldn't even begin to list them.
And do you think it's that kind of vast array of applications that is in some way, ironically, the limiting factor? It's hard to, you have so many people working in different strands, from different strands in different realms. How do we collaborate and form more of a solid group? How do we know what other people are doing? It's that connectivity that I think Lapidus is trying to do.
Yes,
Um,
which is brilliant.
but you can see the challenge, as you say, because everyone can write, and people, and it can be, as you've described for yourself, deeply personal. And therefore, I think it's just hard to sort of draw it in.
Yes,
And we just need to keep doing that, as you and your colleagues have kind of set us on this path. It's up to us to take what you've given us and keep going with it. Because it's your turn to now look at your legacy and, as you say, start feeling comfortable throwing things away, and it's our turn to take the torch, I guess. I'm seeing this conversation as a personal challenge.
yes,
I don't know if it's obtuseness on my part, but I really don't understand this barrier. The fact that because most people write and, you know, most people draw, at least at some stage in their lives, and they dance and they sing. And I do not really understand the issue. because I don't see it as necessarily curtailing creativity. If your focus is on skills and the values and the ethics, then it allows for breadth of how you choose to deliver it, depending on the environment and the area. I do think that it would be useful to have a separated, you've got writing for well-being as a very distinct discipline, and therapeutic writing. But just as, I've said this before, but just because you have monkey music for mums and their tots doesn't mean you don't have music therapy. And one does not negate or delegitimize the other, in my mind. But maybe I'm missing something, because I've heard, very learned people and experienced people think differently. But in terms of speaking to the other thing, which is that in some ways it is elitist, well, then I would argue then we need to focus on research that is inclusive and that is bringing people in. And also, the more that people can make a career out of this and make money without also being a therapist or a coach or being a specific writing therapist, the less elitist it will be, and the more open it will be to people from a broader intersectionality. But
totally agree with what you're saying. I just don't know why it hasn't happened. I can't answer that question. Why hasn't it become something that Meta has devoured and offered back to us, as a therapeutic practice?
I feel that something that Lapidus is trying to do is trying to build the skills, so that and we were talking about that even in our last board meeting. So people aren't reinventing the wheel, and it takes that generosity of sharing resources and not being precious about our individual work, which I understand can be problematic, because people put a lot of time in it, and it costs. But I think the more we can be generous and create a resource and start to be teaching the fundamentals that allow people not to have to be experts in everything. So we've got deeply impressive people like Poonam Madar and, who seem to be able to do everything, but we shouldn't be relying on people having either the time or the ability or the resources to do that. It would be great if we could be providing the skills of how to get arts funding, all the individual things, so that whatever people have to offer, it can be contained and held and supported, so that we can keep developing and moving forward, I think.
Yes.
Well,
it's flourishing, and I can only hope that it will continue to flourish.
It's been a lovely conversation. We're coming to the end of our time together today. I don't know if you have any final words of advice for new practitioners starting out.
I would be wanting to promote the idea of reflective practice, because I'm concerned that some people who start out don't know the value of having, I'm not going to call it supervision, because that implies a model that is more akin to counselling or coaching. And all it is, and we started to do this 3 or 4 years ago, is to get together with a group of people and to appoint someone to keep time and to have a set of, for want of a better word, boundaries, the ground rules that we're probably all very familiar with, and to look at the work you're doing in that safe environment. We used action learning sets in Lapidus International and got quite a long way with it. It was on the website, but I don't think it's there anymore. But it's a crucial part of practice, that nobody is working in isolation and falling into what might be perfectly innocent ways of working, which are harmful to them. It's also about self-care. It's the 6th ethical principle is self-care. So as well as do no harm, there's the idea that some of this work we do can be challenging emotionally, psychologically, And so I would want to highlight the need, without there being an expensive requirement, for practitioners to use their own resources and their own skills to take the time, and it might be as little as an hour and a half a month, to talk about that practice with others. Yeah.
That is an excellent point, and I invite listeners to read the issue 5 that will be coming out hopefully soon, where we have Jane Willis writing a wonderful piece about her peer support group, and it has advice on how to start your own, and how they have created a boundaried and therapeutic and mutually supportive framework for each other.
Yeah, it's exactly it.
Yeah. So, and also listeners, please look out for Ask in the next Jeannie
That's a
and
great
Bob will do
initiative.
advice column in issues 4 and 5 of Lapidus magazine, and do get in touch at magazine@lapidus.org.uk. What would you like to read and hear more of? Who would you like us to be in conversation with next? Please let us know. And Jeannie has provided a rich amount of resources just in dialogue, and we will try and put those together and include them in the article that we'll write up on this talk. So thank you so much again, Jeannie.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jeannie. It's been so enlightening hearing your ideas and your sharing experiences with us. Thank you.
Been a great pleasure, and it's kept me warm.